Some places don't stay silent. They wait for the right person to listen. The road into Pine Hollow twisted through miles of forgotten forest, where the trees leaned close like they were guarding something older than memory. And at the end of that road, a weathered cabin stood half buried in shadow, its wood gray with age, its windows dark like eyes that had seen too much and chosen not to speak. And that was where Daniel Hayes stopped his truck, engine ticking softly as it cooled, his hands resting on the steering wheel a second longer than necessary, as if he felt it too, that strange pull in the air, the kind you don't hear, but somehow understand. Beside him, Atlas, his 6-year-old German shepherd, lifted his head slowly, ears sharpening toward the cabin before Daniel even opened the door, the dog's amber eyes fixed, unblinking, alert in a way that went beyond training, as if something beneath the ground had just whispered his name. The cold air wrapped around them the moment they stepped out, carrying the faint scent of pine and something older, metallic, like rain that had been waiting too long to fall. Daniel adjusted his worn flannel jacket, boots crunching against gravel as he approached the cabin, each step echoing louder than it should in the stillness, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full, like it was holding its breath. Atlas moved ahead of him, slower now, deliberate, nose low to the ground before suddenly stopping at the front steps, his body stiff, a low sound rising from his chest, not quite a growl, not quite fear, but recognition. Daniel frowned, resting a hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension beneath his fur. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, though part of him already knew this wasn't just another empty place. The cabin door creaked open with a tired sigh, revealing a dim interior where dust drifted in thin shafts of light, the air inside colder than outside, still and heavy like it had been sealed away from time itself. Daniel stepped in slowly, his boots brushing against old wooden floors that groaned under his weight. Atlas followed, but his focus never shifted, his ears twitching, his gaze fixed downward as if the answers weren't in the walls or the ceiling, but somewhere beneath their feet. Daniel set his pack down near the doorway, scanning the room, the faded furniture, the stone fireplace long gone cold, the faint marks on the walls where something once hung but had been taken or forgotten. It looked like a place no one had touched in decades, and yet it didn't feel abandoned, not completely, as if something had remained behind, waiting patiently. Then it came, so faint Daniel almost missed it, a soft vibration under the floor, like the echo of a distant pulse. Atlas reacted instantly, head snapping up, ears locked, a quiet, urgent whine slipping from his throat as he stepped forward and placed one paw firmly against a section of the wooden boards. Daniel froze, his breath catching slightly. The sound came again, steady, rhythmic, too precise to be random, every 27 seconds, like something beneath them was counting, remembering, or trying to be found. Daniel slowly knelt down, placing his palm flat against the floor where Atlas stood, and this time he felt it clearly, a deep, subtle thump rising through the wood, not loud, not violent, but alive in a way that made his chest tighten. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as the silence around them seemed to shift, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for this exact moment, for someone who would stop long enough to notice. And beside him, Atlas didn't move, didn't look away, because whatever was down there, it had already begun calling them both. The sound did not stop. It stayed steady and patient, as if it had been repeating for years without anyone noticing. Daniel kept his hand pressed to the floor, counting under his breath the way he used to in places where timing meant everything. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, until the faint thump returned again exactly as before, not random, not natural, something deliberate hidden beneath layers of wood and time. Atlas shifted closer, his paw still resting on the same spot, his breathing slow but focused, the kind of focus that only came when something mattered. Daniel exhaled through his nose and glanced around the cabin again, this time not as a visitor, but as someone being watched by a place that had its own memory. The boards beneath them were older than the rest of the room, darker, worn differently, as if they had been opened and closed more times than the others before finally being forgotten. He reached for his pocket knife and slid the blade carefully into the narrow seam between 2 planks. The wood resisted at first, stiff with age, but then gave a little with a dry, quiet crack that seemed too loud in the stillness. Atlas stepped back just enough to give him space. But his eyes never left the opening, never blinked. Daniel worked slowly, prying one edge upward, the board lifting inch by inch until a breath of colder air slipped out from below, carrying that same faint metallic scent, stronger now, like something sealed had just been disturbed after decades of waiting. He paused, listening. The rhythm beneath them did not change. It continued, calm and unhurried, as if it had expected this moment all along. When the board finally came free, Daniel set it aside and revealed a narrow gap beneath, not empty, but covered by something else, a second layer, a rusted metal surface hidden just below the wood, its edges lined with bolts dulled by time. Atlas let out a soft, low whine, stepping closer again, nose hovering just above the metal as if he could hear more than Daniel ever could. Daniel brushed away the dust with his sleeve, revealing the faint outline of a square hatch, no larger than 3 feet across, built solid, intentional, not something that happened by accident. His pulse slowed instead of racing, the way it always did when something unknown began to make sense. This was not just a cabin, and whatever was beneath it had not been placed there. Carelessly, he ran his fingers along the edge until they found it, a small indentation near one corner, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. He pressed gently and felt a slight shift, not open, but responsive, like a lock that had not forgotten how to move. Atlas suddenly stiffened again, ears tilting toward the far wall, then back to the hatch, then back to Daniel, a silent signal that something had changed, not outside, but inside the moment itself. Daniel leaned closer, placing his ear near the metal surface. And there it was again, clearer now, the steady pulse, not hollow, not mechanical, but layered with something deeper, like water moving far below stone, or something larger shifting in slow, careful intervals. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the sound settle into his memory, trying to understand it without forcing it, because forcing things like this never worked. Atlas lowered himself beside the opening, body pressed to the floor, guarding it without being told, his presence steady, grounding, the only thing in that room that felt completely certain. Daniel opened his eyes and looked down at the hidden hatch once more, and for the first time since he had arrived, he realized this was never about finding a place to stay. It was about being led to a place that had been waiting for someone who would actually listen. Daniel did not rush, because something about the hatch made rushing feel like a mistake, like interrupting a conversation that had been happening long before he arrived. He sat back on his heels for a moment, studying the metal surface, the way the bolts were placed, the way the edges had been sealed with care instead of haste. This was built by someone who wanted it to last, not to be found easily. Atlas shifted beside him, his tail low, not in fear but in awareness, his eyes flicking between Daniel and the hatch as if waiting for permission or warning him without sound. The steady pulse beneath them continued, patient, unchanged, as if it had all the time in the world. Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out a small multi-tool, the weight of it familiar in his hand. Grounding, he leaned forward and tested one of the bolts. It resisted at first, but not completely. Time had weakened its grip just enough. He turned slowly, carefully, the faint scrape of metal against metal echoing softly through the cabin, each movement deliberate, each second measured, the kind of quiet work that demanded respect more than strength. Atlas lowered his head closer to the hatch, ears angled forward, listening not just to the sound, but to something deeper, something Daniel could not quite name. One by one, the bolts began to give, not easily, but steadily, until the edge of the hatch shifted just enough to reveal a thin dark line. Beneath, colder air slipped through again, stronger this time, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to decay or neglect, but something preserved, something untouched. Daniel paused, his hand resting on the metal, and for a brief moment, a memory surfaced without warning, a place far from here where silence had meant waiting, where every sound mattered because it told you what was hidden beneath the surface. He blinked, grounding himself back in the present. This was different. There was no danger in the air, no urgency, just a quiet insistence, like the land itself was offering something rather than hiding it. He slid his fingers under the loosened edge and lifted slowly. The hatch resisted once more before giving way with a deep, heavy creak that seemed to settle into the bones of the cabin itself. Atlas immediately stepped back, not out of fear but to make space, his body tense, ready, as if he understood that whatever came next would matter. The opening beneath revealed darkness at first, thick and complete, but as Daniel leaned closer, he noticed something else, a faint glow far below, not bright, not artificial, but soft, like light reflected through water. He narrowed his eyes, adjusting to it, and realized it was not just light. It was movement, slow, rhythmic, echoing the same pattern they had been hearing. Every 27 seconds, a gentle shift, a pulse, as if something beneath the earth was breathing. Daniel rested one hand on the edge of the opening, steadying himself. The air rising from below was colder, but not lifeless. It carried a quiet energy that made the space feel less like a void and more like an invitation. Atlas let out a low sound again, softer this time, almost curious, stepping forward just enough to peer into the darkness beside Daniel, his ears twitching as if trying to catch something just beyond reach. Daniel swallowed slowly, not from fear but from the weight of the moment, because he understood now that this was not something he had discovered by chance. This was something that had been waiting, not for anyone, but for someone willing to notice the small things, the quiet signals, the patterns most people would ignore. He reached into his pack again, pulling out a small flashlight, but when he flicked it on and aimed it downward, the beam felt unnecessary, almost intrusive, because whatever light was already there did not need help to be seen. It only needed someone to look long enough to understand it. And as Daniel stared into that hidden space beneath the cabin, one thought settled clearly in his mind. Some places do not hide their secrets, they simply wait for the right person to be still enough to find them. Daniel lowered himself carefully through the opening, his boots finding the first rung of a narrow metal ladder hidden just beneath the hatch. The cold air rising around him felt different now, not empty, but layered with something ancient and steady. Atlas hesitated only a second before following, his paws moving with quiet precision, as if he had done this before in another life. The faint glow below grew clearer with each step, not harsh like electric light, but soft and shifting, like reflections dancing across water deep underground. Daniel kept one hand on the ladder and the other lightly brushing the stone wall beside him, feeling its texture, rough yet deliberate. This space had not formed naturally. It had been shaped, guided, built by hands that understood both time and patience. The steady pulse continued, stronger now, not just heard but felt through the air itself, a gentle rhythm that seemed to move through his chest as much as through the ground. When his boots finally touched the floor below, he paused, letting his eyes adjust fully. The space opened into a wide chamber carved from stone, its ceiling arched naturally, but reinforced in places with old wooden beams darkened by age. At the center of the chamber lay a shallow pool of water, perfectly still except for the slow ripple that moved across its surface every 27 seconds, each ripple catching the soft light and bending it into a glow that filled the room without any visible source. Atlas stepped beside him, his reflection briefly visible in the water before the next ripple distorted it into something almost unreal. The dog's ears shifted as he listened, not tense now, but calm, as if whatever they had found was not a threat, but something meant to be witnessed. Daniel took a slow step closer to the pool. The air here was colder but cleaner, carrying a faint mineral scent that reminded him of mountain springs, the kind of places untouched by anything except time. He crouched near the edge, watching as the next pulse moved through the water, perfectly timed, perfectly measured. And then he noticed something else. Along the far wall, partially hidden in shadow, stood a wooden table, simple but carefully placed, as if it belonged exactly where it was. On top of it rested a small metal box, and beside it, a journal, its cover worn but intact. Daniel stood and moved toward it, each step echoing softly in the chamber. Atlas followed close, his gaze shifting between the pool and the table as if both mattered equally. Daniel reached out and brushed his fingers across the journal first, the leather cool to the touch, preserved by the environment around it. He opened it slowly. The pages inside yellowed but steady, the handwriting neat, deliberate, and unmistakably personal. His eyes moved across the first line, and then he stopped, his breath catching not from fear, but from recognition, because written clearly across the top of that page, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, was his own name, Daniel Hayes. The ink faded but undeniable. Atlas let out a soft sound beside him. Not a warning, not a question, but something quieter, something that felt like understanding. Daniel stared at the page for a long second, the steady pulse of the water behind him continuing without interruption, as if this moment was simply another part of a pattern that had already been set in motion long before he ever stepped into the cabin. And in that stillness, one truth settled quietly into his thoughts. Some journeys do not begin when you take the first step. They begin long before, and only reveal themselves when you finally arrive. Daniel did not move for a long time, his eyes fixed on the name written in that steady, deliberate hand as if the letters themselves carried weight beyond ink and paper. The quiet pulse from the water continued behind him, marking time in a way that felt both measured and infinite. Atlas sat beside him now, no longer tense, his posture calm and grounded, as if whatever question had been building since they entered the cabin had finally found its place. Daniel turned the page slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile paper, and the words that followed were written with the same clarity, the same intention, as if the person who wrote them knew exactly who would be reading. The entry was dated nearly 40 years earlier, long before Daniel had ever stepped into this forest, long before he had even existed in the form he knew himself now. And yet the words spoke directly to him, not in mystery, but in quiet certainty, describing a place beneath a cabin, a pulse beneath the earth, and the idea that some lives are guided not by chance, but by patterns too subtle for most people to notice. Daniel felt a slow breath leave his chest as he read, not fear, not disbelief, but a strange recognition, like hearing a story you do not remember learning, but somehow already understand. Atlas shifted slightly, his nose brushing Daniel's arm as if grounding him in the present, reminding him that whatever this was, it was real, it was happening now. Daniel turned another page, and this time the writing changed, becoming more personal, less like a record and more like a message. The line spoke of waiting, not in frustration, but in patience, of building something not for immediate use, but for the right moment, for the right person, the kind of patience that did not demand answers, but trusted that answers would come when they were meant to. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the journal as he read a line that made him pause, a line that spoke of a man who would arrive not looking for anything, but carrying a quiet weight, someone who had learned to listen because he had known what it meant to be unheard. The description settled into him with an uncomfortable precision, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just accurate in a way that felt impossible to dismiss. Atlas let out a soft breath, lying down beside the table, his eyes still watching, but relaxed now, as if whatever this place was, it recognized them as much as they were beginning to recognize it. Daniel closed the journal halfway, not to stop reading, but to steady himself. The chamber around him remained unchanged. The water continued its slow rhythm. The light continued to shift gently across the stone walls. Nothing rushed, nothing demanded. Everything simply existed in quiet alignment. He looked toward the pool again, watching as another ripple spread across its surface, perfectly timed, perfectly consistent, and for the first time he understood that this was not a signal of something hidden, but a reminder of something constant, something that had always been there whether anyone noticed or not. He opened the journal again, his eyes returning to the page with a steadier focus. And as he continued reading, one thought settled clearly in his mind, not loud, not overwhelming, but certain in a way that did not need to prove itself. Some things are not meant to be found by searching. They are meant to be found by becoming the kind of person who finally knows how to see them. Daniel turned the next page more slowly this time, as if he had begun to understand that the pace of this place was not something to rush. The handwriting remained steady, but the tone shifted again, no longer describing what had been built, but why it had been built at all. The words spoke of a time when the world above had grown too loud, too fast, when people had forgotten how to listen to the quiet patterns beneath their feet. And so this place had been created not to hide from the world, but to preserve something the world had started to lose. Daniel's eyes moved carefully across each line, absorbing not just the meaning but the intention behind it. Atlas remained beside him, his breathing slow and even, his presence a steady anchor in a space that felt both unfamiliar and deeply known at the same time. The soft pulse of the water continued to echo through the chamber, no longer strange, but almost comforting, like a rhythm that had always been there just beneath awareness. Daniel turned another page and found a diagram, simple but precise, showing the chamber, the pool, and lines extending outward beneath the ground like veins, connecting to places far beyond the cabin itself. Places not marked by names, but by symbols that felt older than language. He studied it for a moment, his brow tightening slightly as he realized this was not an isolated structure. It was part of something larger, something that extended beyond what he could see. Atlas lifted his head suddenly, ears angling toward the pool, and Daniel followed his gaze just as another pulse moved through the water. But this time it was different. The ripple carried a faint shimmer of light that lingered longer than before, stretching across the surface before fading slowly. Daniel stood and stepped closer again, drawn by the subtle change. The air around the pool felt warmer now, not by temperature, but by presence, as if something within it had shifted in response to his attention. He knelt at the edge once more, watching closely, and when the next pulse came, he noticed something he had missed before. Beneath the surface, faint shapes moved with the rhythm, not objects, not reflections, but something more like impressions, as if the water held memories instead of matter. Atlas let out a quiet breath, his tail giving a small, slow movement, not excitement, but recognition. Daniel reached out, hesitating only a second before letting his fingertips touch the surface of the water. It was colder than he expected, but not harsh. In the moment his skin made contact, the ripple changed, spreading outward in a wider circle, the light intensifying briefly before settling again. And in that instant, something passed through him, not a sound, not a voice, but a feeling, clear and undeniable, like being reminded of something he had forgotten but had always known. He pulled his hand back slowly, his heart steady but his mind quiet in a way that felt different from before, not empty, but aligned. Atlas moved closer, pressing lightly against his side, grounding him again as the chamber returned to its steady rhythm. Daniel looked back toward the journal, then to the metal box resting beside it, its surface untouched until now. And for the first time since he had entered the space, he realized that the journal had not been the only thing left behind for him. It had only been the beginning, and whatever came next was not something he needed to search for. It was something that had already been prepared, waiting for the moment he was ready to understand it. Daniel reached for the metal box with a steadier hand than before, not because he understood what it was, but because something in him had stopped resisting the feeling that this place already understood him. The surface of the box was cool and smooth beneath his fingers, untouched by rust, unlike the hatch above, as if it had been protected deliberately, preserved for a moment that had just arrived. Atlas stood close at his side, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, not in tension but in quiet support, his eyes fixed on the box with the same focused calm he had shown since they entered the chamber. Daniel studied the lid for a moment, noticing there was no visible lock, no latch, only a small circular indentation at the center, about the size of a coin, its edges worn just enough to suggest it had been used before, but not often. He hesitated only briefly before placing his thumb into the indentation. The metal felt warmer there, as if it responded to touch rather than force. And for a second nothing happened. The chamber remained still. The water continued its slow pulse behind him, and then the box gave a soft click, so quiet it almost blended into the rhythm of the room. The lid lifted slightly on its own, not fully, just enough to release a faint breath of air from inside, carrying a scent unlike anything above ground, clean, almost like rain before it falls. Daniel lifted the lid carefully, and inside he found not gold, not anything that would fit the kind of treasure people searched for, but a set of objects placed with careful intention, a folded map, a small compass, and a single photograph. He picked up the photograph first, drawn to it without thinking. The image was old, its edges softened by time, showing a man standing beside a dog, both facing a structure that looked strikingly familiar. The same cabin, though newer, untouched by years. The man's face was calm, steady, and something about it felt deeply familiar in a way Daniel could not explain. Not identical, not obvious, but connected, like a reflection seen through water. Atlas leaned closer, his nose hovering just above the image before giving a small, quiet exhale, as if he recognized something too. Daniel turned the photograph over and found a single line written on the back. The ink faded but still clear enough to read. Not everything valuable can be carried. Some things must be continued. The words settled into him slowly, not as a command, but as a realization. He set the photograph down and unfolded the map next, its paper thicker, more durable, marked with the same symbols he had seen in the journal, lines extending outward from this chamber to other points. Other places hidden in plain sight, each marked not by names, but by meaning. Daniel traced one of the lines with his finger, feeling the quiet weight of it. This was not about what had been left behind. It was about what still remained to be found. Atlas shifted his stance, turning slightly toward the ladder, as if sensing the next step before Daniel had fully formed it in his mind. The dog's instincts had guided them here, and now they seemed to be guiding them forward again. Daniel picked up the compass last, its needle already moving, not spinning wildly, but settling slowly in a direction that did not match north, instead pointing toward one of the marked paths on the map, steady and certain, as if it knew where it was meant to lead. Daniel closed his hand around it, feeling its quiet pull, and in that moment, he understood something he had not realized before. This place was never meant to end with discovery. It was meant to begin something else entirely. And as he looked from the compass to the map, then to Atlas standing ready beside him, one thought settled clearly and without hesitation. Some paths do not appear until you are willing to follow them. Daniel did not speak as he folded the map carefully and placed it back beside the journal, not because there was nothing to say, but because this place did not ask for words, it asked for attention, for presence. Atlas stepped ahead toward the pool again, his movements slow and deliberate, his ears relaxed but alert in a quieter way now, as if the urgency that brought them here had softened into something steadier. Daniel followed, the compass still resting in his hand, its needle holding firm in that same direction, unwavering, as if it was not guiding him away from this place, but deeper into what it meant. He knelt beside the water once more, watching the next pulse form, the ripple, spreading across the surface in that same perfect rhythm. But this time he did not just observe it, he understood it. The timing was not a signal to be decoded, it was a pattern to be felt, a reminder that some things move forward not through force, but through consistency, through quiet repetition that builds meaning over time. Atlas lowered his head slightly, his reflection steady in the water until the next ripple passed through it, bending it gently without breaking it. Daniel reached out again, letting his fingers rest just at the edge this time, not disturbing the surface, just feeling the air above it. And he realized something he had not noticed before. Each pulse carried not just movement, but a subtle warmth, a shift that traveled through the space like a breath, slow and even, as if the chamber itself was alive in a way that did not require explanation. He glanced back toward the table, the journal, the box, all of it still there, unchanged, waiting, not to be taken, but to be understood. The photograph, the map, the compass, none of them were rewards, they were reminders, pieces of something larger that could not be owned, only continued. Atlas turned his head slightly toward the ladder, then back to Daniel, his gaze steady, patient, not pushing, just present. Daniel stood slowly, the quiet weight of the moment settling into something clearer, something more grounded. He looked around the chamber one more time, not searching, but recognizing, the stone walls, the beams, the water, all of it held together by intention rather than accident. This place had not been built to hide from the world. It had been built to preserve a way of seeing it, a way of listening that most people had forgotten. He stepped back from the pool, the compass in his hand still pointing, still certain, and for the first time he did not question it. He accepted it, not as an instruction, but as a direction that would reveal itself one step at a time. Atlas moved toward the ladder without hesitation, placing his paws on the first rung and looking back, not asking, just confirming. Daniel gave a small nod, almost to himself, and followed, climbing upward slowly, the light from the chamber fading behind him but not disappearing, because he realized it was not something left below. It was something he carried now, something that had shifted quietly inside him. And as they emerged back into the cabin, the air above felt different, not because it had changed, But because he had, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, layered with meaning he had not been able to hear before. Atlas stepped out onto the wooden floor, his posture calm, his tail giving a small, steady movement. And Daniel stood there for a moment, looking at the open hatch, the place that had revealed something deeper than anything he had expected. And in that stillness, one simple truth settled clearly into his mind. Some discoveries do not end when you leave them behind. They begin when you choose to carry them forward. The cabin felt different the moment Daniel stood upright again, not because anything inside it had changed, but because the silence no longer pressed against him. It settled around him like something familiar, something that had finally been understood. Atlas moved ahead slowly, his paws soft against the wooden floor, his ears relaxed but still attentive, as if he was listening to something that had not disappeared, only shifted beyond hearing. Daniel reached back and gently lowered the hatch into place, the metal settling with a quiet weight beneath the boards, the sound final but not closing, more like sealing something that did not need to be opened again to remain present. He placed the wooden plank back carefully, aligning it with the others, and for a moment he rested his hand there, feeling the stillness beneath, no longer searching for the pulse, but aware of it, as if it had moved from the ground into something deeper inside him. Atlas stopped near the doorway, turning his head slightly toward the forest outside, his posture alert in a different way now, not focused on what was hidden, but on what was ahead. Daniel followed his gaze, stepping toward the open door, the late afternoon light stretching long across the clearing, the air carrying the quiet scent of pine and earth, unchanged, and yet somehow sharper, more defined. He stepped outside and paused on the small wooden porch, the forest standing tall and still around him. The same trees, the same path, but no longer just a place he had arrived at. It felt like a place he had been brought to. The compass rested in his hand, its needle still holding steady in that same direction, unwavering even here, under open sky. Daniel looked down at it briefly, then back toward the line of trees where the path faded into shadow. The direction it pointed did not stand out. There was no sign, no trail marker, nothing to indicate that anything waited there, and yet the certainty of it remained. Atlas stepped forward off the porch and onto the ground, his movements smooth and confident, his tail low but steady, as if he already knew which way to go. Daniel watched him for a second, then stepped down as well, the gravel shifting under his boots with a familiar sound, grounding him in the present. He did not rush. He did not question. He simply followed, the forest path narrowing as they moved deeper, branches arching overhead, the light filtering through in soft patterns that moved with the wind, the kind of movement that once would have gone unnoticed, but now carried its own quiet meaning. Atlas led without pulling, without urgency, just a steady forward motion that felt more like guidance than instinct. Daniel glanced once over his shoulder at the cabin, now partially hidden by trees, its presence still there, but no longer the center of what mattered. It had given what it was meant to give, and now it remained, waiting again, not empty, but complete. He turned back and continued walking, the compass still steady in his hand, the map folded in his pocket, not as instructions, but as reminders. The forest grew quieter the further they went, not silent, but deeper, layered with sounds that did not compete, only existed together. The soft crunch of leaves, the distant movement of wind, the steady rhythm of his own breath, and somewhere within that quiet, Daniel realized something that settled into him without effort, without resistance. He had spent years searching for direction in places that demanded answers, in noise, in motion, in constant movement. But this quiet path, this steady forward step, this was different. This did not demand anything. It revealed itself one moment at a time, and as Atlas slowed slightly ahead, turning his head just enough to make sure Daniel was still there, one simple truth became clear in a way that did not need to be explained. Some paths are not about where they lead, but about who you become while walking them. The forest did not rush him. It unfolded slowly, step by step, as if each foot of ground carried its own quiet story waiting to be noticed. Daniel walked with a steadier pace now, no longer driven by curiosity alone, but by a calm understanding that whatever lay ahead would not reveal itself all at once. Atlas moved just a few feet ahead, his path neither random nor rigid, weaving gently between trees with a confidence that came not from urgency, but from familiarity, as if the direction was not something he followed, but something he remembered. The light shifted as they moved deeper, the sun lowering just enough to stretch long shadows across the forest floor, turning ordinary branches into shapes that seemed almost intentional. Daniel's boots pressed softly into the earth, the ground changing beneath him from loose gravel to packed soil, then to a layer of fallen needles that softened each step. And with each change, he became more aware of how the world beneath him responded, how nothing here was static. Everything adjusted, everything moved in quiet harmony. The compass in his hand remained steady, its needle fixed in that same direction, not pulling, not demanding, simply present. A constant reminder rather than a command. Atlas slowed suddenly, his body lowering slightly, not in fear but in attention, his ears tilting forward as he stopped near a small clearing where the trees parted just enough to allow a wider breath of light to fall across the ground. Daniel stepped beside him and looked ahead. At first there was nothing unusual, just a patch of earth surrounded by tall pines. But then he noticed it. The way the ground itself seemed slightly different, smoother, almost untouched compared to the rest of the forest floor, as if time had moved around it instead of over it. Atlas stepped forward carefully, placing one paw onto that space, then another, his movement slow and deliberate. And the moment his weight settled fully, something shifted, not in sound, not in sight, but in feeling, a subtle change in the air, like the pause before a breath is taken. Daniel felt it too, that same quiet alignment he had felt below the cabin, but now it was here, above ground, woven into the open world instead of hidden beneath it. He stepped forward as well, his boots pressing into the same space. And for a moment nothing happened. The forest remained still, the light unchanged, the wind silent. And then the smallest detail revealed itself, a faint line beneath the surface of the ground, barely visible, tracing a shape that was not natural, a circle, wide and precise, its edges softened by time but not erased. Daniel crouched, brushing away a thin layer of needles and soil, revealing more of the pattern beneath, carved stone, smooth and deliberate, forming a ring that extended several feet across. Atlas stood at the center, his posture calm, his gaze steady, as if he understood this was not something to react to, but something to witness. Daniel traced the edge of the stone with his fingers, feeling the same craftsmanship he had seen below, the same intention, the same quiet patience. This was connected, not by chance, but by design. He looked at the compass again, and for the first time, the needle shifted slightly, not spinning, not uncertain, but adjusting, settling directly toward the center where Atlas stood. Daniel rose slowly, his breath even, his thoughts clear in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. He stepped into the circle fully, standing beside Atlas. And as he did, the forest seemed to change, not physically, but in the way it held him. The sounds softened, the air steadied, and the moment stretched just enough to be noticed, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just present. And in that presence, Daniel understood something that had been building since he left the cabin. This was not about reaching a destination. It was about recognizing the places where something deeper was already waiting. And as he stood there, the compass finally grew still in his hand, no longer pointing forward, but resting, as if for now he had arrived exactly where he needed to be. Daniel did not move immediately. He simply stood within the circle, his eyes slowly adjusting not to the light, but to the way the space itself seemed to hold him, as if the forest had drawn a quiet boundary around that single point and asked him to notice it. Atlas remained still beside him, his posture relaxed yet attentive, his presence no longer guiding but sharing, as if they had reached a place where both of them understood without needing direction. The air felt different within the circle, not heavier, not lighter, but clearer, like something unseen had settled into alignment. Daniel took a slow breath and let it out, his shoulders easing in a way they had not in years, the kind of release that does not come from rest, but from recognition. He glanced down at the stone beneath his feet, tracing the faint curve of the circle again. And this time he noticed something he had missed before, small markings etched along the edge, almost invisible unless you looked closely, symbols similar to those in the journal, not random, but placed with intention. each one spaced evenly, forming a pattern that felt less like decoration and more like language. Atlas shifted slightly, his paw brushing over one of the markings, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to respond, not with sound, but with a subtle warmth that moved outward from that point. Daniel felt it travel through the ground, through his boots, and into his chest, not startling, not overwhelming, just present, like a quiet acknowledgement. He knelt slowly, placing his hand near the marking Atlas had touched, his fingers hovering just above the surface. And as he leaned closer, he realized the symbols were not worn down by time. They were preserved, protected in a way that suggested they were meant to remain, meant to be found exactly as they were now. He let his fingertips rest lightly against the stone, and the moment he did, the forest around him seemed to soften, the distant sounds fading into a deeper stillness, not silence, but a kind of listening. As if the world itself had paused, Atlas lowered himself beside Daniel, his head resting near the center of the circle, his breathing slow and steady, perfectly in rhythm with something Daniel could not hear but could feel. Daniel closed his eyes. For a brief moment, not to escape, but to focus, and in that quiet, something shifted, not in the space around him, but within him. Memories surfaced, not specific events, but feelings, moments where he had stood in places like this without noticing, moments where something had tried to speak through stillness and he had moved past it without understanding. And now, standing here, those moments seemed to gather, not as regrets, but as pieces of something that had always been leading here. He opened his eyes slowly, the forest returning to its natural rhythm around him, but it no longer felt separate. It felt connected, like a conversation he had finally learned how to hear. Atlas lifted his head and looked at him, his gaze steady, calm, as if confirming what Daniel had just realized without needing to express it. Daniel stood again, his movements unhurried, his posture grounded, the compass still in his hand, but no longer something he needed to check, because whatever it had been, pointing toward was no longer ahead of him. It was around him, within him. The circle beneath his feet was not a destination. It was a point of understanding, a place where everything aligned just enough to be recognized. And as Daniel looked out through the trees, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain. It felt open, not because he knew where it led, but because he no longer needed to. And in that quiet certainty, one thought settled gently into his mind. Some places do not change the world around you. They change the way you move through it. Daniel remained within the circle for a moment longer, not because he was unsure of what to do next, but because leaving no longer felt like stepping away. It felt like carrying something forward. Atlas stood first, stretching slightly before turning toward the path they had come from. Then pausing, his ears shifting as if listening for something beyond distance. Daniel followed his gaze, the forest stretching quietly in every direction, unchanged yet no longer unfamiliar. The air moved gently through the trees, carrying the soft whisper of pine needles brushing against one another, a sound so subtle it could be missed entirely unless someone chose to hear it. Daniel stepped out of the circle slowly, his boots pressing into the forest floor, and the moment he crossed that faint boundary, he noticed something simple yet undeniable. Nothing had been left behind. The stillness, the awareness, the quiet alignment remained with him, not tied to the stone beneath his feet, but rooted somewhere deeper. Atlas began to walk again, not leading this time, but moving alongside him. Their pace matched without effort, as if the need for direction had softened into something shared. Daniel glanced once at the compass in his hand, the needle resting calmly now, no longer pointing with urgency, no longer pulling him forward, and for the first time, he slipped it into his pocket without hesitation, not because it had lost its purpose, but because its purpose had already been fulfilled. The path through the forest seemed clearer now, not physically wider, but easier to follow, each step placed with a quiet certainty that did not rely on signs or markings. The light above shifted as the sun dipped lower, casting a warmer glow through the trees, turning the forest into a place that felt less like something to navigate and more like something to move through with respect. Atlas paused briefly near a fallen log, his nose catching a scent before he continued. His movements relaxed, grounded, no longer searching for what was hidden, but present with what was there. Daniel slowed slightly, placing his hand against the rough bark of a nearby tree, feeling its texture, its steadiness, the way it had stood through years of wind and weather without needing to prove anything. And in that simple contact, he understood something that had been building quietly since he first stepped into the cabin. Strength was not always loud. It was often found in what endured without needing to be seen. He released the tree and continued forward, the path gradually opening as the forest began to thin, the light growing stronger ahead. And as they walked, Daniel noticed how his thoughts had changed, no longer scattered, no longer searching for answers or reasons, but settled, present, aware of each step as it came. Atlas moved beside him with the same calm rhythm, his tail swaying gently, his presence no longer guiding but accompanying. And as the trees finally gave way to a wider clearing, the sky opening above them in a soft expanse of fading daylight, Daniel stopped for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to take in the quiet completeness of it. The journey had not ended. Nothing had been concluded or resolved in a way that needed explanation. But something had shifted, something had aligned. And as he stood there with Atlas beside him, the forest behind them and the open space ahead, one simple understanding settled into him with quiet certainty. Some answers are not meant to be spoken. They are meant to be lived, one step at a time, without needing to be explained to anyone but yourself. The open sky above the clearing deepened into evening, the light turning softer, stretching into shades of gold and quiet blue. Daniel stood there a little longer than necessary, not because he was waiting for something else to happen, but because he understood now that not every moment needed to lead somewhere. Some moments simply needed to be noticed. Atlas sat beside him, his posture calm, his gaze moving across the horizon without urgency, as if he too had settled into the same quiet understanding. The breeze moved gently through the clearing, brushing against the tall grass and carrying with it the faint scent of pine from the forest behind them, a reminder that nothing had been left behind. It had only expanded. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxed, his mind no longer searching, no longer replaying questions that did not need answers. Instead there was space, clear and steady. The kind of space that allowed things to unfold naturally. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the compass once more, holding it loosely in his hand. The needle rested without movement now, not pointing, not guiding, simply still, and for the first time he smiled slightly, not out of relief, but out of recognition. The tool had done what it was meant to do, not by leading him somewhere new, but by bringing him to a place where he no longer needed to follow it. Atlas stood and stretched, then stepped forward into the clearing, his movement easy, unforced, as if the path ahead was no longer something to be discovered, but something to be lived. Daniel followed, his steps light, grounded, the earth beneath him steady and familiar. They moved across the open space together, not toward a destination, but forward in a way that felt natural, the sky slowly dimming above them, the first hints of evening settling in, the kind of transition that happens quietly, without announcement, and yet changes everything all the same. As they reached the far edge of the clearing, the forest opened into a narrow dirt road, barely visible but clearly present, winding gently between distant hills. Daniel paused there, looking at it, not with hesitation, but with a quiet sense of readiness. This road was not marked, it did not promise anything, and yet it felt right in a way that did not need to be explained. Atlas glanced back once, meeting Daniel's eyes, his expression steady, almost knowing, before turning forward again. Daniel slipped the compass back into his pocket, no longer as a guide, but as a reminder. The map remained folded, the journal left behind, the chamber sealed, and still nothing felt lost, because what mattered had never been something he could carry in his hands. It was something he had learned to carry within himself. He took one more step, then another, following the quiet curve of the road as it stretched ahead into the soft fading light, the forest behind him, the open sky above, and the unknown before him, all connected now in a way that no longer felt separate. Atlas moved beside him, not leading, not following, but simply there, a steady presence in a world that no longer felt uncertain. And as they continued forward together, the last light of the day, settling gently around them, one final understanding settled into Daniel's thoughts, simple and clear, like everything else he had learned along the way. Sometimes the greatest thing you inherit is not a place, not a secret, not even a path, but the quiet ability to trust where your next step will take you, even when you cannot see the end of the road.